This video is sponsored by Describe. In my most recent episode of Critical Role Demystified, we saw Percy interrogate the coachman for the Briarwoods, and he did so by using a gun. He threatened violence against the coachman, and when he felt he needed to demonstrate how serious he was, he shot the coachman in the hand. So here's the question for you to consider for your own games. Would this work? Would someone give over information if they were being tortured? I'm not singling out this moment for any reason besides the fact that it's iconic. It made it into the animated series in the 3rd episode because they clearly wanted to get to these Briarwood scenes as quickly as they could. And they left it in because it is an important moment to demonstrate where Percy's head is at by this point in his arc. Arguably, this interrogation method barely works in the live stream. The proper interrogation of Desmond occurs in another episode, and it's handled, no pun intended, much more reasonably, and not at gunpoint. This isn't the first moment in the livestream where the party interrogated someone with the threat, or the practice, of physical violence. We saw it happen at least once in the Underdark arc, maybe more. It also won't be the last moment like this on the show. The Briarwood arc especially gets pretty dark. I honestly could have talked about this subject a long time ago, or I could have waited for a later example, but considering how iconic this moment is, now felt like the right time. See, Dungeons & Dragons has a skill called Intimidation, and while it's a charisma-based skill, there are useful rules and guidelines that can allow and encourage players to use a different ability in its place, like Strength. And when you have the Intimidation skill on your character sheet, you're encouraged to use it to solve your problems. It becomes a tool in your toolkit. And when players are in an interrogation scene and the subject starts to clam up, the players want to do something about that. So it's likely they're going to start to try to take actions, to try to move the needle, to do something that justifies the opportunity to make another intimidation roll. Maybe these actions start to get pretty extreme just so they can try to get advantage. Maybe they start taking out their weapons and sharpening them, demonstrating a willingness to use violence against the subject. If that doesn't work, either because the roll wasn't high enough, or they feel the subject is holding out on them, or just because they want to be as thorough as they can and make sure they tried everything, they might begin to demonstrate use of these weapons on the subject. In short, they might start to do some torture. Now, this is by no means universal. I am fully aware of that. Some of you will likely be totally scandalized at the very concept that someone you're playing a game with would even think of torturing someone. And listen, I've seen it all. The truth is, when you're playing a role-playing game, especially if it's your first time, though not exclusively, a lot of the process is about testing your limits. You're trying to figure out not just what the rules allow you to do, but what the rules don't stop you from trying. In some respects, it's perfectly natural for players to test the waters and see just what they're capable of doing. Add to that the fact that RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons pretty much condition players to solve their problems using their weapons and spells. It is a combat game, and I think it's somewhat inevitable that some groups will do a little bit of light torture without realizing it, or without thinking it's a big deal that it happened. And this, by the way, is to say nothing of the fact that movies and TV have glorified, I will say, dubious interrogation techniques for decades. I'm not saying we're all monkeys who saw torture on TV and decided to do some ourselves, but I do think there's a deeper impact on what we're doing in this hobby specifically, because a lot of us have internalized some version of enhanced interrogation as a storytelling trope. And now, when you're playing a game designed around telling a story, you're going to be influenced by the stories you've absorbed. These things are part of our culture, like it or not. Now, you as the game master might not always be prepared for this moment when it comes up. And once again, there are a lot of reasons why in the moment you might reward this behavior. You might feel, very reasonably, it makes perfect sense, that doing someone harm, or even threatening them harm, is an opportunity for your players to roll an intimidation check. You might feel, again, very reasonably, that the subject would want this to stop as soon as possible and share any information they have, no roll required. You might just want to get to the next beat of the story, so yeah, sure, they get the information they're looking for. Let's please move on to the next scene. I have an encounter we need to get to today. But some of you who've been watching my channel for long enough can probably guess what I'm going to say next. When you reward this behavior at your tables, which again, is a totally rational thing to do when it happens, I totally get it, well, you basically guarantee it's going to happen again, because the players learned that it worked. This is why I recommend that you, as the GM, start thinking about this before it happens at your table. Do you want to run a game where torture works, or a game where torture doesn't work? I'm not casting judgment on either conclusion. This is another question about the style for your games. If you want to run a game that plays on a lot of tropes from movies and TV shows that your players might know, then yeah, it's very tempting to say, torture works in my games. Now, let's pause for a quick sidebar because we're touching on a tricky subject about realism in RPGs. This is another topic that could be a whole other video, but for today's purposes, let's establish a baseline. Not every campaign needs to be perfectly realistic, and not everyone will have the same definition of realism. Further, not every player is looking for realism in the same places. Sure, I think it's fair to say that RPG players in general want a world to react realistically to their behavior. In fact, I'd argue that's one of the biggest selling points tabletop games have over video games, the fact that the GM can actually properly figure out how the people of the world would react to the very specific actions of the player characters. However, there are some things players expect in their games, whether or not they realize it's not how the real world works. There was a good stretch of time where I was being quite a stickler for trying to make a few aspects of my games more realistic, and chief among those aspects was probably non-lethal damage. When players dealt enough damage to kill an enemy but instead wanted to knock them out, I'd instead narrate that the opponent was disarmed, or harmed or taken down in a way that took them out of the fight but didn't render them unconscious. I tried to make the case that in the real world, people don't get knocked out easily, and they don't get back up easily either. In reality, being knocked unconscious for even a brief amount of time can cause serious brain damage pretty quickly. Now, let's set aside the question of whether I was being a needless pedant, because we know the answer, I absolutely was. But even with that being the case, it's my world, it's my game, I can do whatever I want, it can work however I say. But not only was it in friction with what my players wanted, which it was, by the way, because they wanted that cinematic style of hitting someone over the head at the end of a fight and then maybe tying them up and interrogating them later. But even setting that aside, it was also in friction with my own playstyle. I tend to run extremely cinematic games, and there are plenty of tropes that I employed in my games, and then players would be confused because they felt it wasn't realistic. Maybe I already knew that, or maybe I was narrating something that I thought was realistic because I'd seen it in movies. And sometimes I'd answer, yeah, I don't care about that in this case, we're going to let it happen. Now that's full rule of cool, and you can always just employ rule of cool in your games. But that's why realism is such a tricky thing to employ in RPGs, because we don't always know what we don't know. For example, if I have a player who describes trying to intimidate some wolves and becoming their alpha, I personally know that the alpha dog study was based on some seriously flawed science, and that's not really how wolf packs function. The player might not know that. Meanwhile, if I describe firing an arrow with a rope tied to it and someone says that's not actually something that works in the real world, I didn't know that. It makes sense once I hear them say it, but it's something that I had never questioned, because I'd seen it in movies and TV, and it seemed cool. People did it, it seemed cool. This is one of the reasons so many games default to shorthand, and why shorthand is so powerful in RPGs. Because once we start trying to make our games realistic, we're also trying to figure out how things work in the real world. And there are some things we might not realize aren't realistic. Additionally, different players have different priorities for realism, and what takes one player out of a realistic game might not bother another. So in a lot of ways, realism isn't always the most useful factor for making decisions about what to allow in games and what to ban. That's specifically why the rule of cool exists beyond just breaking the game rules. It can also help adjudicate what to do in a situation where something might not be realistic. There are also times when players or GMs just have misconceptions about what is or isn't realistic. How many times have we heard someone argue that a certain form of prejudice is realistic for a medieval fantasy setting when A, that's usually not actually true, and B, they're ignoring the fact that this is a game with dragons and wizards. That's something we're going to talk about more another time, believe me, but spoilers for that video, this is why people say things like that. Because the accepted shorthand has permeated so many of our minds, it's hard to break with that mentality. And sometimes the shorthand is valuable, because something being more realistic isn't necessarily more fun for the players, or more interesting from a dramatic perspective. For example, knocking someone out is a lot more efficient for storytelling purposes, and it makes the players' jobs easier. Add to that the fact that their entire plan might have hinged on the possibility that they could have knocked out their enemy and get away with them, and now finding out in the moment that knocking someone out doesn't work that way could be a rude awakening. And now you have a bunch of examples for why I pull back on some aspects of realism in my games if they don't serve another function to make the game more fun, or more tense, or more interesting. That being said, in the real world, torture doesn't work. And more of us should talk about that. There's tons of research demonstrating exactly this, that torture produces inaccurate information more often than not. But rather than spend a lot of time here reviewing the report of the US Senate Select Committee on Intelligence's study of the CIA's detention and interrogation activity from 2001 to 2009, I want to move into an area where I feel much more comfortable. Pop culture. In the early 2000s, there were 2 TV shows that featured maybe a surprising amount of torture, except for the fact that it was the early 2000s and we as a culture were not doing okay, so I guess it wasn't that surprising. These TV shows were 24 and Lost. I only watched the first season of 24 years after the show was off the air, but even with my limited exposure, the show was pretty famous for the fact that Jack Bauer did all sorts of unethical interrogating to get information from perps during his many seasons of No Good, Very Bad Days. This isn't a value judgment on the show. I'm not going to use "it was a different time" as an argument about something that happened only 22 years ago, but I'm also not going to argue whether or not the show was saying Jack was good for doing this. I'm pretty sure he was meant to be a gritty antihero. And look, I don't know if I've said this yet, but just for the record, nobody needs me to be the one to tell you that in the real world, torture is unethical. And fictional depictions of torture are up to your own discretion about what you do or don't feel comfortable watching. I really don't care. I don't think a movie is bad if there's torture in it, regardless of context, and honestly, there are some enhanced interrogation scenes in movies or TV or books that I think are excellent. Some fictional characters just deserve it, and some scenes are just appropriately badass. Call me a hypocrite if you want, but this really isn't a conversation about whether fictional depictions of torture are always ethical or anything like that. But I do think the context around torture on 24 is interesting, especially given the discourse our culture was somehow struggling with at the time. The fact that it was portrayed as a necessary evil, something that Jack had to do to get the bad guy, and specifically that he was doing it as a representative of American law enforcement, was one of many depictions of torture that ran a very dangerous risk of normalizing the practice in the minds of American citizens. The kind of thing we might think of today as propaganda. Or, I guess if he's a member of the government and not just local police, it's just regular propaganda. However, I think the torture on Lost was far more interesting. Lost is a show that I enjoy a lot. I still think a lot of it holds up. Although, ironically, it doesn't lend itself well to the modern binging format, despite the fact that it undoubtedly played a huge role in the hyper-serialization of mainstream TV. So did 24, for that matter. But slight spoilers for the first 2 seasons of Lost here. One of the characters, Saeed, had served in the Iraqi Republican Guard, and had experience as a brutal interrogator. A lot of his flashbacks are about his history of torturing people and his effort to try to leave that part of his past behind. There's a really interesting duality with the torture scenes we see depicted, well, not usually on screen, but the ones that are major plot points. Every torture he committed in his past is regrettable, something that he hates that he did. But we also have no reason to assume that they didn't work. We know that the first person he tortured did give over the information, and none of his qualms about his other victims have anything to do with the fact that real-world torture doesn't yield consistent or reliable results, just the fact that torture is unethical. Which, fair enough, I also think it's unethical. I'm glad they weren't trying to glorify it on this show. But then, in the present, there are a few times on the island when he's forced to use those torturing skills to get information out of someone. And there are a few times he himself gets tortured. The added irony about when he gets tortured is that Saeed is usually not actually hiding anything from these people. So, torturing him was always pointless, because he was already telling them the truth, or he really wasn't who they thought he was. And torturing him to see if he changed his tune was, wrong and bad. And once again, spoilers for the first 2 seasons, but every time he tortures someone on the island, it fails. Whoever he's torturing doesn't feel particularly inclined to give him any additional information. Whether or not they're telling the truth before he tortures them, they don't change their story. And even if they are definitely withholding something from him, the torture doesn't make them give it up. So after a while, he stops doing it. So once again, you can do whatever you want in your games, but for all of the reasons I've listed, I strongly recommend you run your games in such a way that torture doesn't work. I'd personally encourage you to discuss this subject in your Session 0 and let players know, hey, just like in the real world, torture doesn't work, and that's how it's going to be in my games. If you torture someone, you're going to get false information. If you didn't bring it up in your Session 0, no worries. The next time it looks like your players are heading into a tense interrogation scene, just tell them, just so you're aware, torture isn't really an accurate way to get information. If you go down this road, you might not be able to trust what they tell you. Now, you might not want to pull back the curtain that far, so maybe you can have them roll an insight check first if you want. But Considering the game has both an intimidation skill and an insight skill, it's very easy for an interrogation scene to become a game of chicken, where your players are not going to quit because they'll keep rolling both skills until they're satisfied. That's why I do recommend telling them this, even if there's no way their characters would necessarily know that torture doesn't work. Because you should probably do what you can to keep your players from going down a road they don't need to, when you could have stopped them with some proper warning. Of course, it's possible your players have no specific desire to torture, but their interrogations trend that way because when they're trying to be cool and intimidating, they can't think of anything else to do or say or try. They don't necessarily know the right questions to ask or how to frame their requests in a way that seems reasonable but doesn't give up any of their authority. Which is why you and your friends should sign up for today's sponsor, Describe. Describe has thousands of scenes that you can drop directly into your game when you're struggling to find the words. For example, here's the scene for Persuasion of a Henchman to Reveal Information. That seems pretty relevant to our interests today. Do not think of this as treachery. You are simply letting a few words float harmlessly into the air, a burst of aimless information told to no one in particular. And who knows, you might even find some coin in your pocket afterwards. But of course, they've got way more kinds of scenes than just interrogations. They have descriptions of items, locations, monsters, villains, NPCs, player characters. They've even got maps and music. It is an incredible resource. And the fine folks at Describe have been kind enough to sponsor today's video. If you visit describe.com/supergeek and use the promo code SUPERGEEK, you can save 10% off of your first subscription payment. Once again, that's dscryb.com/supergeek. Thank you so much to Describe for sponsoring this video. Thank you so much for watching. This was a pretty heavy topic, but it's one that I think about all the time. Hopefully it helps you in your own games. If you want to support the channel, there are a few ways you can do that. You can subscribe and ring the bell to get notified about new videos as soon as they come out every Monday and Thursday. You can support me financially on Patreon. Every new patron at any dollar amount really helps the channel. You only have a few days left to vote in my poll to help decide when the next Patreon livestream will be held, so make sure to get on that. If you can't support me financially, I completely understand. You can still help by joining the Discord and be a member of a really cool community and hang out with other people who enjoy this channel. And you can sign up for my newsletter to get updates about the big things I've got going on. This player dealt a lot with what your player characters do and how they behave, and so if you haven't watched my video about how adventurers might be perceived in your games, I recommend you check that out. I'm really proud of that one. Until next time, play fair and have fun.